London in the spring of 1944 carried a strange weight in the air, the kind that pressed silently on the chest without ever announcing itself. People felt the war shifting, felt history tightening like a fist, but they did not yet know that the greatest military operation ever attempted was now, only weeks away. They sensed it through whispers, through glances, through the odd stillness of soldiers who once filled pubs with laughter. They sensed it because something in London was different. American boots had begun to echo through the streets in a rhythm too solemn, too heavy, too deliberate to be simple marching practice. It began early one grey morning. Fog hung low over rooftops, rolling like a thin blanket along the Thames. A milkman on Baker Street heard it first. Distant, steady thumping. Not vehicles, not artillery. Boots. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. Then what sounded like thousands, moving in coordinated silence. He paused, hand frozen on the handle of his metal crate, and listened. The booming steps grew louder, echoing off shop fronts and narrow brick alleys. Curtains lifted. Doors opened. Londoners stepped. Outside, drawn by instinct more than curiosity. They didn't know what they were about to see, but something, some small electric pull, told them it mattered. A constable at the corner of Marylebone Road squinted into the fog and finally saw the shapes emerging. American soldiers. Marching in perfect formation, rifles shouldered, helmets catching faint droplets of mist. Their boots struck the pavement in steady, unbroken rhythm, but there were no voices, no laughter, no whispered jokes, not even the sound of a breath out of place. The silence unsettled the crowd more than any noise could have. These were not the loud, confident, gum-chewing Yanks London had grown used to seeing in pubs or buying candy for children. These men were focused, tightened, sealed. The march rolled forward through the waking city. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping. Newspaper boys stopped mid-shout. A few British soldiers, passing by on bicycles, slowed and stared, knowing immediately what the civilians did not. These Americans were on the move for something enormous. A woman in her 30s, holding a steaming cup of tea, felt her throat tighten. She whispered, "This isn't training. This is farewell." A sergeant near the front of the American column glanced sideways, just for a second, at the people lining the pavement. He saw the worry in their eyes. He saw the way mothers pulled children close. He saw men who had survived the Blitz standing still as statues, hats lowered, respect written across their faces. But he turned forward again quickly. Orders were absolute. No talking, no stopping, no revealing of destinations. The mission had already begun the moment their boots touched the street. Every now and then, one soldier's gaze drifted upward at London's familiar buildings. The pubs, the brick apartments, the bakeries that smelled of warm bread. They had lived in this city, trained here, recovered here. Some had even fallen in love here. Now they were marching, through it for the last time, though no one dared to say the words aloud. A boy of about 10 stood on the curb, gripping a wooden toy Spitfire. The Americans marched past him in endless lines, faces determined and impossibly young. The boy called out, "Good luck, Yanks!" The soldier, nearest to him, couldn't answer. He simply lifted 2 fingers in a quick, subtle gesture, half salute, half goodbye. A British officer standing nearby noticed something else, something haunting. The Americans' gear smelled faintly of oil, seawater and canvas soaked with salt. It was not a smell carried during normal marching drills. It was the smell of men already packed for ships. Civilians felt a chill as the columns continued. They stretched for blocks, then neighborhoods, then beyond what the eye could measure. It seemed as though all of America was flowing through London in one long river of boots, helmets, and heavy packs. Buses paused at intersections. Taxi drivers leaned against their cabs, caps held against their chests. The soldiers marched past Piccadilly Circus, then down toward Westminster, their silhouettes framed by statues and landmarks that had stood for centuries. The stone lions of Trafalgar Square watched silently as the living tide of men passed beneath them. Every corner of the city seemed to hold its breath. Many of the soldiers kept their faces forward, but their eyes flicked quietly toward familiar places. The shop where they had once bought tea, the door of a flat where a girl had waved from a window, the pub where some had spent their last evening of freedom. None of them knew whether they would ever return. At a narrow street near Victoria Station, an elderly man removed his hat and held it over his heart. His voice shook as he whispered, "God guide you, lads." The Americans did not break formation. They did not speak, but something subtle shifted in their posture, as if they felt the blessing settle on their shoulders. A chaplain marched near the center of the column. Unlike the others, he allowed himself small glimpses toward the civilians. When he saw the elderly man, he gave a slow nod, acknowledgement, gratitude, and sorrow, all pressed into one gesture. A woman stepped forward slightly and called gently, "Father, you'll pray for them, won't you?" The chaplain replied softly, "Ma'am, I already am." The Americans continued marching. As they moved farther south, the heart of London fell behind them. The noise faded. The streets stretched wider. Houses grew smaller. Gardens tidier. Civilians stood not in thick crowds now, but in clusters. Families, neighbors, shopkeepers, all watching a sight they knew they would never witness again. The soldiers finally allowed themselves one brief look back toward the skyline of the city that had sheltered them. Some swallowed hard, some clenched their jaw, some whispered silently inside their own minds the truth none were allowed to speak. This is goodbye. The American columns moved deeper into the southern edges of London, where the streets opened like quiet channels guiding them toward the waiting countryside. The fog began to thin, allowing soft streaks of sunlight to fall across the helmets and shoulders of the marching GIs. Though their steps remained perfectly synchronized, a faint shift in mood drifted through the ranks. A realization that the city was slowly falling behind them, that the final familiar sights were disappearing, and that every new stretch of road carried them closer to the unknown. The outer neighborhoods had none of the noise of central London. Here, the air smelled of damp earth, garden soil, and chimney smoke. Children leaned over small wrought-iron fences, clutching rag dolls or tin toys as they watched the endless stream of foreign soldiers pass in near ghost-lip silence. One little boy, barefoot on the cool pavement, raised his hand in a tentative wave. A tall GI from Tennessee, his face lined despite being no more than 23, allowed himself the slightest smile before refocusing on the march. He had no idea if the boy would be old enough to remember him, or whether he himself would ever live long enough to remember this moment in return. On a narrow residential lane, an elderly woman emerged from her doorway, holding a small tray with cups of tea. She had offered tea to British soldiers heading to the front during the Great War, and felt it was only right to offer the same kindness to these American boys. But the MPs gently shook their heads, signaling that the soldiers could not break formation. The woman nodded in understanding. Then she did something unexpected. She placed the tray on a chioma garden wall, folded her hands, and bowed her head as the men marched by. Her gesture was quiet, solemn, almost ceremonial. The Americans, still forbidden from stopping, simply walked past, but many felt her blessing settle into their bones. A lieutenant marching near the front glanced at the tray of untouched tea and whispered to himself, "If we make it back, I'll come find her." He knew immediately he was lying. Not because he didn't want to return, but because he understood the odds awaiting them across the channel. Still, the thought brought a brief, fragile comfort. Farther ahead, another company passed a local school where teachers had lined up their students along the fence. The children stood straight, hands clasped behind their backs, instructed to remain respectful and silent. But silence proved too difficult for one small boy who squeaked out, "Goodbye, Americans!" before a teacher gently hushed him. The soldiers' boots kept pounding the pavement, but a faint stir, almost a ripple, seemed to pass through the ranks. One GI blinked rapidly, battling the sudden warmth rising behind his eyes. He had siblings the same age back home, waiting in a farmhouse thousands of miles away. The image of them tugged sharply at his chest. The march carried on. In the distance, the roar of truck engines began to blend with the rhythm of boots. Supply convoys rumbled down adjoining roads, splashing muddy water as they passed. Their canvas backs were filled with rations, ammunition, medical gear, and other supplies the infantry would need once the invasion began. The GIs knew that every box, every crate, every fuel canister represented the scale of what awaited them, a landing so massive, so dangerous, that failure was unthinkable. They also knew that not everyone who marched in these columns would survive long enough to use the supplies currently rolling beside them. Among the civilians watching, it became increasingly clear that the Americans were moving, with a purpose far greater than any training exercise. A shopkeeper, still in his apron, murmured to his wife, "Look at their faces. They're leaving, love. They won't tell us, but they're leaving." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the soldiers as they disappeared around a corner. The wind carried a faint scent of the sea now, briny, sharp, unmistakable. The soldiers noticed it too. It meant the southern coast was drawing near. For some, the smell filled them with dread. For others, it brought clarity and renewed determination. They had trained 2 long years for this, and now the moment was approaching. The columns passed through a small marketplace where vendors had paused mid-setup. Crates of vegetables lay open, barrels of apples gleamed with dew, and one butcher leaned against his stall, wiping his hands on his apron, silently watching the procession. He had butchered meat for soldiers in both wars, but he had never seen a march like this. Never this many foreign young men heading toward danger with such quiet resolve. He reached into a crate, grabbed a handful of apples, and tossed them gently toward the soldiers. They bounced harmlessly off boots and rolled along the road. The men could not stoop to pick them up, but they noticed. The gesture lingered in their minds. Just beyond the market, the columns narrowed into single-file lines to cross a small stone bridge spanning a shallow creek. Water trickled beneath them, cold and clear, reflecting the steel helmets passing overhead. A sergeant from Ohio glanced into the water and felt a strange pang of nostalgia. It reminded him of a creek behind his childhood home where he used to fish with his father. For the briefest instant, he imagined that he was back there, barefoot, laughing, carefree. But the illusion broke the moment his boot hit the far side of the bridge. Reality snapped sharply back. Ahead lay the coastal roads and the fog-veiled staging areas where they would wait for the order to board the invasion ships. The sun climbed slightly, casting long shadows across the road. The day was growing brighter, but the mood in the columns grew heavier. They could no longer pretend this was a routine march. Every step carried the weight of finality. A corporal murmured under his breath, "This is it." No one answered, but several heard him, and none disagreed. The southern outskirts of London blurred as the columns of soldiers marched steadily toward the marshalling camps along the coast. Roads once familiar to the locals now seemed almost alien under the weight of marching boots and heavy packs. Civilians had grown silent watchers of the procession, standing in small clusters along hedgerows and curb edges, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and admiration. No street, no lane, no alley seemed untouched by the passage of these men, whose very presence carried the weight of impending destiny. Every helmet, every rifle, every marching step told of battles yet to come, and the uncertainty that lay beyond the Channel. In the small villages outside London, children ran along the sidewalks, waving flags hastily sewn from scraps of cloth. Farmers paused in fields, leaning against fences, squinting toward the lines that stretched endlessly as if the entire country were funneling through their narrow roads. One man, a teacher from a nearby village, recalled the scene in his diary. "I have seen armies pass before, but never with such purpose. They did not speak, they did not sing. Each man seemed to carry an invisible weight, yet they marched with grace, as though even fear had been drilled from them." At one crossroads, a young American lieutenant halted briefly, just long enough to check the alignment of his men. Even these small movements were orchestrated perfectly, as if the entire march were a single living organism. Civilians noticed the precision and whispered among themselves, wondering if the soldiers felt the same tension that they themselves felt in their chests. The countryside was calm, deceptively quiet. Only the rhythmic beat of boots against the asphalt, the faint clinking of gear, and the occasional low murmur of an officer's command broke the stillness. Alongside the roads, old men nodded silently, and women clutched small tokens, bouquets of flowers, or letters meant to convey silent blessings. Many understood without words that these columns were more than a movement of men. They were an omen of what was to come. An air of solemnity settled over the villages, a shared understanding between observer and observed. At one junction, a boy of 12 ran alongside a smaller group of soldiers, holding a model airplane he had carved himself. He called out eagerly, "Good luck!" And a sergeant glanced down, smiling faintly, before returning his eyes forward. Civilians later spoke of the quiet dignity, the almost sacred solemnity that these men carried, knowing, perhaps instinctively, that each step brought them closer to fate. Nearby, an elderly couple leaned against a stone wall. The husband muttered a prayer under his breath. The wife's hands were folded tightly, as if willing protection into existence. Their eyes met the line of soldiers and held them there, memorizing faces, gear, movements, and expressions, hoping somehow to carry away a piece of history in memory alone. At a farm crossing, wagons and livestock had been moved aside, and the villagers worked quickly to maintain order, yet without disturbing the soldiers' rhythm. The Americans acknowledged the effort only briefly with polite nods, but the gesture, however small, was received as immense gratitude by those who had prepared the path. The march stretched on for miles, over hills and through quiet lanes, each soldier bearing the gay weight of unknown futures, each observer carrying the silent hope that the men would return. A platoon paused briefly near a bridge crossing a gentle stream. Orders were strict, no lingering, no conversation. Yet the soldiers' eyes caught the reflections of trees and water, of flowers and stone walls, for a moment connecting their humanity to the land they were leaving behind. Beyond the bridge, the road widened into the high grounds overlooking the coast. From this vantage point, the soldiers could see the flatlands that led directly to embarkation camps. The officers kept formation tight, knowing that any disorder could ripple backward through the immense column. Civilians watched from cottages perched on the hillsides, some raising binoculars to glimpse the men more clearly. It was, by all accounts, a breathtaking sight. A moving river of soldiers flowing steadily toward an uncertain destiny. The columns of soldiers had now left the familiar streets of London far behind. Rolling hills, quiet lanes, and patchwork fields stretched ahead, the English countryside serving as a silent witness to history in motion. Civilians lined the roads wherever possible, holding flowers, flags, or simply standing in awe, their eyes tracking the endless line of marching Americans. Every soldier carried his own thoughts, fears, and anticipation, though the formation remained impeccably strict. Some glanced at distant rooftops and fields they had trained near, sensing the contrast between serene farmland and the storm of battle that awaited them across the Channel. For many, this was the last glimpse of England's green valleys, the last touch of the soil that had been both home and sanctuary for months. A young private from Ohio kept his gaze forward, thinking of his family back home, imagining that the letters he had written would never arrive if he did not return. Beside him, a medic carried supplies and a small journal, scribbling quick notes during rare pauses, aware that this journey was etched into history, and that his observations might one day tell the story to generations who had not witnessed the march themselves. Fields and villages blurred past in a rhythmic cadence of boots on asphalt. An elderly woman, leaning on a gate, muttered a quiet blessing. God watch over them all. And a soldier in the column caught her words, feeling a warmth he had not expected. The juxtaposition of life's normalcy and the enormity of the mission ahead struck everyone with profound force. As the march approached the southern embarkation zones, the soldiers passed long stretches of countryside transformed by war preparations. Sandbags stacked neatly along narrow bridges, temporary barracks camouflaged against hillsides, and military vehicles parked in disciplined rows. Civilians stepped aside, allowing the columns to move uninterrupted. The air smelled faintly of sea salt carried inland from the Channel, mixed with dust, oil, and the faint tang of horses used to transport supplies. Every step seemed heavier than the last, weighed down not only by equipment, but by the unspoken knowledge that beyond the water lay danger, uncertainty, and death. A small boy ran alongside the edge of the road, waving a handkerchief, shouting encouragement. A soldier reached down briefly, tipping his helmet in acknowledgement, a silent human connection in a world dominated by order, discipline, and preparation. Officers maintained formation, issuing commands in clipped tones, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. They knew that any misstep could have cascading effects on the thousands of men marching behind them. Still, there was space for humanity in fleeting gestures, glances, and nods. The towns along the coast had prepared for the influx of troops. Cafes offered tea and bread, local residents handed out small packages, and children ran along the periphery, curious and excited. Soldiers accepted what they could, polite yet focused, fully aware that indulgence must be brief. The last miles were the heaviest. As the embarkation ports came into view, the landscape shifted subtly. Flat plains opened toward the Channel, cranes marked the loading areas, and the faint smell of salt and tar filled the air. Civilians lined the fences, waving flags and hats, their eyes glimmering with pride, fear, and hope. Soldiers kept formation, eyes forward, but some allowed themselves a fleeting glance at the shoreline, knowing that the sea beyond would soon carry them into history. The silence of the march remained profound. There were no songs, no calls, no jokes, just the rhythm of boots against pavement, the quiet hum of anticipation, and the occasional snap of a rifle strap or the clink of metal against metal. A chaplain walked along the edge of the column, murmuring prayers under his breath for the men in front and the men behind him. Civilians felt the presence of faith, hope, and human connection intertwined with the unfolding event. The embarkation zones were now visible, long piers, crowded docks, and the first ships prepared for the crossing. Officers signalled directions, ensuring every platoon knew its place. Soldiers adjusted packs, checked gear, and read final orders, knowing that the next steps would carry them across water into uncertainty and danger. Parents, friends, and neighbours had come to witness the last farewell, understanding that these marching columns were the bridge between safety and battle. The city behind them, the countryside around them, and the coastal horizon ahead became part of a shared memory, etched into hearts and minds forever. Letters had been written but not yet sent, messages of love and longing carried silently in pockets and packs. Soldiers glanced once more at the familiar shores, committing the images to memory, before focusing fully on the task ahead. The rhythm of boots became hypnotic, almost ceremonial, marking not only movement, but preparation, reflection, and unspoken resolve. Civilians understood that this was more than a march. It was the embodiment of courage, commitment, and sacrifice, and they stood in quiet awe, bearing witness to the transition from training to battle. As the columns reached the final approach to the piers, the first ships became clear, their hulls lined for loading men, vehicles, and equipment. The soldiers tightened formation, each step synchronized with precision, while the chaplain offered final words to those who paused briefly, a human acknowledgement of bravery and mortality. Families waved desperately from fences, hoping that these men would return. Children shouted encouragement, adults nodded solemnly, and even the soldiers themselves seemed to feel the gravity of the moment more profoundly with each step. The embarkation had begun. Boats were prepared for the channel crossing. And every movement, every command, and every soldier was accounted for meticulously. Civilians watched, hearts swelling and breaking in tandem, understanding that history was being made in front of them, one disciplined step at a time. The silent march had carried the soldiers from familiar streets to the brink of the unknown. London, the countryside, and the coastal villages had witnessed the last farewell before a momentous invasion, an event that would alter the course of the war. And as the soldiers stepped onto ships, their faces reflected determination, anxiety, and hope, a mirror of the city and country that had sent them forth. The march was over, but its legacy, observed in quiet streets and rolling fields, would echo forever in memory and history. Those who had watched believed, without question, that the Americans marching through their land were not merely soldiers, they were the bearers of courage, destiny, and the promise of a turning point in a war that had engulfed the world. The silence that had accompanied the march remained in the hearts of civilians, the rhythm of boots lingering in ears long after the last soldier had embarked. Letters were written, prayers were offered, and memories were sealed. The march was complete, the soldiers were at sea, and London, forever changed, understood that it had witnessed the final farewell before a day that would reshape history. D-Day.